Today, we save Denerim. Today, we avenge the death of my brother King Kaelan. But most of all, today,
we simp harder for Dragon Age Origins than you with your favorite muscle mommy.
For Ferelden!
Welcome to aaaall Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been thumbing for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. And today, we have the last game. The very last game that truly made me feel like I hadn't seen it all in the world of video games. The game that saved me from the belief that the best years in gaming were behind us, that the golden age of games was history. The game that made me realize that great things, marvelous things, things the likes of which we have never seen before are yet to come. Yup, I am not even exaggerating. The Witcher 3, which came out 6 years later, and Baldur's Gate 3, which came out just last year, were impressive in their own right, and they took things to the next level when they came out. But nothing in those games felt like something that I hadn't seen before. Hell, if you check out my video on the top 10 games from the 2000s, you'll see that I placed Dragon Age Origins above games like Baldur's Gate 2, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and Arcanum.
How dare you!
Well, today, I am ready to die on that hill. As you know, I review games using a system of categories that I think are relevant to the genre of the game at hand. But I fear that for this video, I am going to be using this system of categories to defend why I think this game is ridiculously awesome in almost every respect. Dragon Age Origins is a CRPG-ish game with real-time with pause mechanics, and when it comes to those, character creation and character progression are up first. I got my first great impression from this game as soon as I got to the character creation screen, when I saw that not every class was available to every race, and that each race had its own set of unique origins. I thought, oh, this is going to be good. I just hope I get to see this uniqueness actually play out in the game. And boy, oh boy, was I in for a treat.
Wake up, gentlemen. More travelers to attend to. Led by a dwarf, oddly enough. Led by an elf, of all things. I'd guess the pretty one is the leader.
We don't see many dwarves in these parts. You here to trade? Need something? I don't generally talk to strange elves who wander in here. You don't look like the other folk fleeing the south. Were you in the battle?
Have you seen an elf running about? Young woman, red hair, carrying a suit of chain. You there, elf. Where's my armor? And why are you dressed so preposterously?
You shouldn't be here, dwarf. Your kind don't leave the market district.
You're no surface dwarf, I can see it in your eyes. Smart of the Grey Wardens to look for new recruits in Orzammar. You look familiar. Have I seen you at the Landsmeet? I hear you're from the Circle of Magi. First Enchanter spoke highly of you. A great achievement, for one so young. I see you're a Dalish. Marek knew a Dalish elf once. Never saw an equal with the bow before or since.
You're the dwarf who walks with the Grey Wardens. A respectable decision. Maker's Breath, another elf. What do you want?
There are 6 different origins for you to choose from in Dragon Age Origins. Each of them has its own prologue, its own set of quests, NPCs, and locations. But the best thing about these origins is that the first time you get to play the game, once you're through with your origin story and set out into the world, you are going to feel like a stranger in a strange land, which is exactly how your character would feel given the circumstances. If you play as a castless dwarf in Orzammar, you are a thug who lives in an impoverished part of town, and you have little choice but to sell your services to the local crime lord. People treat you with disdain because you are castless.
Whatever horrid deviants you're descended from were written out of the histories and deemed unworthy to join the ancestors. Obviously they bred anyway.
And you wear a garish brand on your face that leaves no doubt about where you come from. After a few minutes of kicking about, you know your place in the world and what you are up against in life.
This man is no warrior. He is castless, rejected by the ancestors. His very footsteps pollute the stone.
But that only lasts a few minutes. because shortly after, you have to leave Ozamar, and once you hit the surface, you are overwhelmed with a tsunami of new things that are totally unfamiliar, some of which are good and some of which are bad. For starters, on the surface, people never mention your brand, and they never treat you like low-life scum, because humans and elves don't know anything about Ozamar's social and political intricacies. They do tend to think that you are a merchant, because most dwarves they know are merchants. But as a castless dwarf, you can play the whole game without even knowing the ins and outs of dwarven politics. They aren't for you because you are castless. But if you play as an Idukan, your entire life is dwarven politics.
The usual. This lord had my cousin killed, this lord seduced my wife, this lord did the exact thing I'd planned to do to him, but he did it first.
And you rarely ever meet a castless dwarf. Similarly, playing as any type of dwarf, you'd be completely oblivious about city elves living in the alienage, or about Templars and mages. What are Templars? Why do they watch over mages? Why are mages considered dangerous? And what the hell is a Maleficar? These are things that you are going to have to piece together from the context as an outsider who's never been out of Ozamar. But when you are a mage, this is pretty much the bread and butter of your day-to-day reality. And this is just straight out
amazing.
The feeling of belonging in this game, the sense of idiosyncrasy is second to none. And this feeling is consistent all throughout the game. Everyone acknowledges that you are an elf, or a mage, or a dwarf. If you are an elf, the quartermaster in Ostagar immediately talks down to you because he thinks you are a servant, even if you're Dalish, because to humans, especially if they are commoners, all elves are the same, because a quartermaster in the army wouldn't know much about history, so the tattoos on your face mean nothing to him. You are just a knife ear, and the ones he has met have all been servants thus far. The Lost Kid in Lothering tells you that his parents say that dwarves are all greedy, but that you are not greedy at all because you gave him some coin. Sir Perth says that he is unsure about how to address a dwarf of your station, and if you are an elf, even Liliana will be uncomfortable around you and she'll try extra hard not to say anything racist. I guess she'd be right at home in the modern world. And this is something that you just don't see in other games. As for the classes available in Dragon Age Origins, the game does quite a lot with very little. There are only 3 classes in the game, and warriors and rogues share 2 of the game's talent trees, dual wielding and archery. And you would think that having only 3 classes greatly cripples the variety of gameplay styles and tactics, and you'd be wrong. Each class has a broad array of talents and many ridiculously awesome synergies for you to experiment with. And the cross-class synergies in this game are amongst some of the best that I've ever experienced. Playing the game again after at least 12 years, I still feel like a tactical mastermind every time I use Cone of Cold to freeze 3 enemies and then one-shot each of them with my Riposte, Cripple, and Punisher talents. Mages have a spell called Glyph of Repulsion, which pushes enemies back unless they pass a Constitution check. It's the perfect spell to put on a choke point, and Glyph of Paralysis paralyzes the first enemy who steps upon it. But if you cast Glyph of Repulsion and then Glyph of Paralysis on top of that, you'll unleash a Paralysis Storm, which will paralyze everyone within the range of the AoE. And you can cast both of these spells even if you don't have line of sight. I think you can put 2 and 2 together, just as you can put this little combo with Cone of Cold and Riposte and Cripple and Punisher together. Each class also has its own set of specializations. These work like archetypes in other RPGs, and despite the fact that each specialization has only a handful of skills, they effectively translate into unique gameplay styles. Take for example the Ranger specialization for the Rogue class, which allows you to summon wolves and bears. This specialization will make you play your character like a hunter who sends his or her pets to tank the bad guys while he wears them down with his ranged attacks. And this playstyle is quite different from the standard melee rogues who seek to maximize their crits through positioning. You have the Arcane Warrior specialization for the mages, which basically turns your mage into a melee combatant. And although there is a lot of combat to be done in Dragon Age Origins, it is a story-first RPG, and that's why I find very fitting that some specializations can only be learned when you have a good enough approval score with a companion who can teach it to you, or when you read the appropriate manual, or when you complete the corresponding story event. Your characters also have skills like persuasion, nature, combat, traps, etc. And these can only be acquired if you have invested enough attribute points in their governing attributes. Some of them are used to overcome various non-combat challenges, and some others are helpful in combat. There are even some combat talents that have a minimum combat skill requirement. Persuasion is easily the most interesting skill, as talking people into doing what you want is usually the best way to get the most satisfying results story-wise. But this skill depends on your cunning stat, so mages and warriors might have a bit of a harder time becoming the silver-tongued charlatans they need to be to get the best outcomes everywhere. One thing that I immediately loved about Dragon Age Origins' progression system is that every time you level, no matter which class you play, you gain 3 attribute points and a talent point to spend however you wish. And what I like about this is that I feel 100% in control of my character's progression. There are no spells that are learned automatically, and the system lets me hyper-focus on the branch of talents of my preference or cherry-pick skills to build my character exactly the way I want. And it's super awesome when you look at your talent tree and think, I can't wait to learn this spell and combine it with this other spell. It's going to be amazing. And 9 out of 10 times it works exactly the way you expected. Skill progression is a little bit different depending on the class. Rogues gain skill points every 2 levels, and warriors and mages every 3 levels. Those who care about the appearance of their characters are in for a treat. Dragon Age Origins has selectors for everything, from the size of your eyes and the distance between them, to the distance between the tip of your nose and your lips, to the size of your lips and the width of your mouth. It's actually quite impressive and ahead of its time. And there are several mods that add even more options for you to play around with. If I had to level some criticism at Dragon Age's character progression system, I'd say that combat talents and non-combat skills feel a little too constrained, like talents are for combat, skills are for non-combat situations. I would have liked it if combat skills had been useful for exploration and other non-combat stuff. Maybe Shield Bash or the Stone Fist spell, for example, could have been used to break down iron doors. Maybe the Paralyze spell could have been used to freeze a trap in place so that you could walk past it. In Arcanum, for example, you could use Stone Throw on a chest to have your Ogre champions identify it as a target and break it open savagely when your lockpicking skills were shit. And it was awesome. The game allowed you to use your skills creatively, and it rewarded you for it. More recently, in Divinity Original Sin 2, you could use combat skills like Retreat to get to places that would otherwise be inaccessible. Overall, if you are the kind of guy or gal who likes to have a gazillion multi-classing options with a trillion spells and 10 million combinations, and if this is where you find your fun and your replay value, then Dragon Age Origins isn't for you. It's also definitely not trying to be for you if you are that guy or gal. But again, a character creation system is only as good as the freedom it gives the player to go on about the game's challenges in his or her own way. And for the type of game Dragon Age Origins is, its character creation system is almost as good as it gets. Gameplay. Dragon Age Origins features combat, questing, and exploration in its own way, and let's start with that. Dragon Age Origins level design is not particularly intricate or complex, and there are just a few locations that you can go to that aren't part of the game's critical path, and there are also a few non-mandatory rooms and caves. So don't expect Elex or Everspace 2 levels of exploration here. What you do have is quite a few inconspicuous little secrets in some of the game's most important locations. And figuring them out will make you feel quite good about your powers of observation and your thoroughness. But more importantly, being thorough in your exploration is how you find some of the most powerful non-DLC items and some of the most powerful bosses too. This dragon boss, for example, can be quite elusive if you are not thorough in your exploration. And this mofo, which is one of the hardest bosses in the game, you can only fight if you complete a series of obscure exploration missions. Dragon Age Origins is a story-first game, but combat is also very important. Combat in this game uses a system of real time with pause, and it is very tactical. pulling enemies and using line of sight to your advantage, luring enemies into choke points, prioritizing your targets, and interrupting their most harmful attacks are all vital tactics in this game. You can straight out forget about tanking and spanking, because that's not how you defeat enemies in Dragon Age Origins. Also, crowd control is crucial in this game. In fact, I would say that in any difficulty level beyond normal, crowd control is the name of the game. Because when you're not outnumbered, you are taking on enemies that have truckloads of health who can also kill you and your companions in 1 or 2 blows. And there are several situations in which you'll have to deal with runners who can call on more enemies. Mages are particularly nasty as they can crowd control you from very far away and can deal massive amounts of AoE damage. Luckily for you, there are many ways for you to neutralize their advantages. Your arsenal includes some of the most fulfilling synergies out there. They might take a little bit to master, but they are oh so awesome once you know how to pull them off regularly. Enemy diversity in Dragon Age Origins is pretty good. You have various types of darkspawn, demons, humans, animals, dragons, and other creatures. And they also have a pretty varied arsenal of attacks. Some have incapacitating attacks, others do damage over time, some debuff you, some hit like trucks, some have nasty AoE attacks, etc. Now, I usually don't like when your success in combat encounters depends on you knowing what the enemy is going to do beforehand, especially when you have little or no time to figure out a fight during the fight, because it makes it impossible for you to course correct and come out victorious even if you had a bad start, also known as save scumming. And well, know that this is going to happen in Dragon Age Origins, and it's probably going to happen a lot. Knowing in Dragon Age Origins is not half the battle. It's often 2/3 of the battle, or even 100% of the battle. But I don't have a problem with this in Dragon Age Origins. But Alex, you've bitched about this being bad game design in the past. Why the change of heart? Well, because save scumming in this game is actually fulfilling. It's a little bit like Desperados 3 in this respect. A game of trial and error to figure out what works out best. And when you finally work out a way to kill the enemy without getting beat up too badly, you feel good about it. I do feel like some combat encounters in the hard difficulty level punish you way too severely for not knowing what to do beforehand, or for clicking on the wrong spot of the screen when you use a skill. But don't worry, by your 7th playthrough, you're going to be able to do this blindfolded.
I'm sorry, what?
What? I expect you're going to play this game at least 10 times. You also have a tactical panel, and I think this is an excellent feature, but it could have been a lot better. A lot of the micromanagement that you do during combat encounters in this game, you do because the tactical panel is lacking a few very important options in my opinion. For example, within the enemy status menu, you have can't attack, movement impaired, and immobilized, in addition to many other conditions, but you don't have the frozen condition specifically. So if you want to use Wind's Stonefist skill on enemies that are frozen, for example, you're going to have to micromanage that one. Also, you can't stack conditions, so if you want a skill like the Archer's Shattering Shot to be triggered only when the enemy is an elite, and only when he's using a magical attack, and only when he's at long range, you're going to have to micromanage that one as well. Oddly enough, the tactical panel is one of the very few things that Dragon Age 2 does better than Origins. Unfortunately, it's grossly wasted because the combat in that game is insultingly shallow tactically. This is just a minor disappointment though, as combat encounters are complex enough for micromanagement to be fun and challenging. Questing is the crown jewel in this game. I seriously can't think of any game that does this better. Well, maybe a few, but it's up there with the greats for sure. From the beginning of the game and all the way to the end, Dragon Age Origins never ceases to up the ante of the stakes. And to me, this is the game that strikes the perfect balance between a highly structured story and player agency. If you guys were impressed with how much of an impact your decisions, and even your combat efficiency had story and gameplay-wise in Baldur's Gate 3, well, know that Dragon Age Origins did this 15 years ago. For example, if you defend Redcliffe from the undead horde, and you may very well choose not to do this, and only if nobody dies in the battle, then you get a different cutscene and you get rewarded with a special helmet. If you don't give Caitlyn her grandfather's sword back, and you give her enough money to move to Denerim and start a new business, by the end of the game you will learn that she married Bantegan. But if you convinced Vela, the tavern maid at Redcliffe, that she could do better, and you give her some money, and you don't convince Floyd to participate in the fight for Redcliffe, she will work as a maid for Bantegan and eventually marry him. If Floyd doesn't die in that battle, he'll give you a pretty cool ring and have a little something extra to say about how you showed him the value of courage. If you surrender peacefully during this mission, you'll get a lengthy prison break that changes quite substantially depending on which of your companions you appoint as your rescuers. And there are many other narrative doors that open or close depending on your class, race, sex, and even skills. There is one major outcome that is only possible if you are a human female noble, for example. And there is a very lengthy questline that you can only see through to the end if you or any of your companions have good thieving skills. Dragon Age Origins is almost interactive Game of Thrones, only leaner and with a much better ending. And the best part is that all the way through you are in the driver's seat of the story. Dragon Age Origins isn't Fallout, Arcanum, Baldur's Gate 3, or Fallout New Vegas as far as emergent gameplay goes. There are essential NPCs. In fact, you can't kill any NPC unless the story goes that way. But there are just so many decisions, so many ways, big and small, in which you can steer the wheel of the story one way or the other, and so many possible endings that make you feel like the big artificer that made everything happen for everyone, that the lack of emergent gameplay, which is usually a pain point of mine in RPGs, seems like an acceptable trade-off in Dragon Age Origins. But then again, I am a fan. Dragon Age also features a few puzzles, and though they are few in number, they don't feel like an afterthought. They feel like the right type of challenge given the situation. At some point in the game you have to fetch the ashes of the dead prophetess Andraste, and this adventure takes you to an abandoned temple in the ass end of nowhere, and you have to pass a series of trials that very strongly remind me of the final stretch of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and one of them is a tile puzzle, not unlike the puzzle that we see in that film. One thing that I really do not like about Dragon Age Origins is how journal entries are presented. They are presented as a series of pages with numbers on them that mean nothing. If you hover your cursor over them, you can see the name of the entry, but you still need to hover your cursor over every little page to see what it's about. It would have been much better if it had been a simple list of text entries with a scroll, and maybe show a teaser of the codex entry upon hovering your cursor over the entry, but that's just a minor nitpick of mine. To me, the game is fun all the way through. The general consensus is that the passage that requires you to navigate the Fade is a bit of a bore, but I liked it just as much as any other passage, and it introduced a few new fresh mechanics, like the possibility to shapeshift into other very cool forms with different talents, which I thought was super rad. But it's the final stretch of the game that steals the show for me. I don't know if you're one of these youngsters who is coming late to the party and you have played Baldur's Gate 3 but not Dragon Age Origins, but if you are wondering why many old-timer RPG fans aren't all that thrilled with the final stretch of the game in Baldur's Gate 3, is not only because it's the weakest and most rushed part of the game, but it's also because these guys played Dragon Age Origins. And Dragon Age Origins not only did it first, but it also did it way better. The final stretch of the game in Dragon Age Origins is gloriously epic. The meanwhile passage in which you control your other companions is epic, the music is epic, the final fight is epic, and the multiple post-coronation scenes that you get as a result of your decisions are super epic. This is the reason why I have played the game 13 times. I just can't finish the game and not start it over again immediately, even when I have all the cool DLCs and the expansion pack to continue playing. To be fair, Dragon Age Origins in turn draws its fair share of inspiration from Neverwinter Nights 2, and the final stretch of the game also feels suspiciously a lot like the final stretch in Neverwinter Nights 2 Mask of the Betrayer, which you should also absolutely play, by the way. The itemization in Dragon Age Origins is also interesting if you consider the type of gameplay design they were going for. For starters, weapons have tactical value. Bows and crossbows, for example, can be much more efficient in some situations than melee weapons, even for your melee combatants. There are also several sets of armor with extra set bonuses, and if you have all the DLCs, you are going to have an impressive arsenal of super cool weapons at your disposal. With the exception of the Stone Prisoner DLC, which gives you an awesome super mega funny golem companion with some kick-ass tanking skills, in-game DLCs are just extra missions with more combat and excellent loot. But BioWare knew how to play you like a fiddle back in the day. They would show you the king in his armor, using a super badass sword, something that made you think, man, I wonder what the stats on this armor would be if it were real. Look at that sword. Imagine if you could have this sword in-game. And then they made a DLC that gave you the chance to actually get your hands on these items. You also have an enchanting feature in this game which allows you to socket runes into your weapons. It's not a complex or deep system, but it rewards your thoroughness even further, and it can make a significant difference in combat. As for the item stats themselves, don't expect items with interesting talents and synergies like the ones you have in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. This is not that type of RPG. But the items you do get and the bonuses your items do have still make the itemization aspect of the game worthwhile. Overall, this is an 80-hour plus game if you count the in-game DLCs, and it still feels short because you just can't get enough of it, and that's always an excellent sign. Story and lore. Dragon Age Origins lore is my favorite lore in the history of video games, hands down, no question. There are more expansive lores out there, of course. Fallout, D&D, and The Witcher come to mind, amongst many others. But D&D lore has been built over more than 50 years, and it's had all manners of books, games, animated series, and films. And The Witcher video games had 7 books no less to build upon. The 2 original Fallout games feel like they take place in a world that has seen a lot of shit. The minute you set foot in the world of Fallout, you start to have questions like, why do I live in a vault? How come there be people living out there, gathered in sizable communities where there's trade, agriculture, and even entertainment? Why didn't we know about these settlements? Do they even know about us? And what the hell happened? Why is the world a radioactive wasteland? Most of those questions have satisfying answers in the game, and there's much more to sink your teeth into in the Fallout Bible. But in Dragon Age Origins, every character, every location, every little detail is deeply rooted in the game's lore. Take for example the Mabari. These are warhounds that are native to Ferelden, and Fereldans have these animals in high regards. They are a symbol of loyalty and resilience. You see Mabari statues in every major Ferelden city. And when Arl Eamon is talking about the importance of swaying the capital over to our cause, he says, Denerim is as stubborn as a Mabari and as good to have on your side. And if you are curious about these dogs, the kennel master at Ostagar will tell you the story of how they were magically bred to be smarter than any other animal. There are even little sayings about the animal. The Mabari is clever enough to speak and wise enough to know not to.
Does this mean we're going to have this mangy beast following us about now? Wonderful.
He's not mangy.
Also, people have mindsets and expressions that are specific to their place of origin. Humans and elves who live in human cities and settlements say Maker's breath when they are impressed, or every time they fear for their lives. They say Maker preserve us every time they find something appalling. They can also say Andrastis mercy when they are annoyed, or when they witness something they believe to be terribly unjust.
May the Maker watch over you.
Is something humans typically say to someone who is about to embark upon a dangerous quest, and that is usually answered with,
May he watch over us all.
Dwarves, of course, don't ever say these things because they don't believe in the Maker or Andraste. They venerate those ancestors who have contributed to their society in meaningful ways. They call the most illustrious of them paragons. They have their own expressions like Atrostvala, which is a formal greeting that means find your tongue or speak to me, or a trust tunsha, which is a formal farewell. In ancient Dwarven, it was a trust null tunsha, which is only said by Caridin since he's the only one who's been alive that long. Dusters, which is the name given to casteless dwarves, refer to noble lords as deep lords, which is a pejorative term. And these are all colorful little snippets that add to the sense of idiosyncrasy that this game has. No other game, in my opinion, comes close to this. Being a dwarf, or a human, or a Dalish elf, or an alienish elf has meaning. These races are not interchangeable. They are not treated as shallow racial veneers. There's deep lore behind all of them. Take the dwarves once again. Their ruling system is an oligarchy. They have a king, but the king is chosen by majority at the assembly, which acts like a parliament. But only important houses have a representation at the assembly.
And by important, you mean rich.
They also have castes that are like professional guilds. And then you have the casteless, people who descend from criminals. They are forced to wear a brand on their faces to indicate that they are casteless. Since most of them live in a part of Orzammar that is called Dust Town, they are also referred to as dusters. But the term duster can also be used to refer to someone in pejorative terms, even if that person is not casteless or even from Dust Town.
Stone-forsaken fools and dusters.
In Dwarven society, children inherit the caste of their same-sex parent. So if a dwarf woman has a child with a casteless dwarf, and the child is male, he is casteless, and usually bad news for the entire family. Dwarves who leave Orzammar to conduct business in the surface are branded surfacers, and unless they do so with the assembly's blessing, they too become casteless if they stay topside for too long. Topside, by the way, is a colloquial term for the surface. The dwarves are also the most familiar with the Darkspawn, because Orzammar, the only remaining city of the former Dwarven Empire, sits at the end of one of the many entrances to the Deep Roads, a complex system of underground tunnels that used to connect all the Dwarven cities and the various colonies, or taigs, as the dwarves call them. But these tunnels were overrun by Darkspawn long ago. The taigs became isolated and the people who lived there eventually perished. Some people still organize or hire expeditions to scout the remains of the taigs. Some go there to find proof that they belong to a noble family or to recover treasure. Sometimes the assembly organizes expeditions to push the Darkspawn back when their numbers swell. You also have the Provings, which is a local combat sport that takes place in an arena. It's usually used as a form of entertainment, but sometimes it's used to decide some other matters through trial by combat. Nobles can hire champions to fight for them in set trials. And then there's the Shaperate, an academic institution that records history and is often consulted for jurisprudence to settle some disputes. And all this is just Dwarven lore. We haven't even touched upon humans and the cult of Andraste, magic and why mages need to be confined and watched over by Templars in the service of the Chantry, or the different political factions within the Circle of Magi. We haven't touched upon the Dalish elves and how they were driven away from their lands, and eventually joined forces with the human Andrastians to fight the Tervinter Imperium. We haven't touched upon other nations like Orlais and Antiva, whose history is also relevant to the story in Dragon Age Origins.
Massive spoilers coming your way.
You might want to keep an eye out for the spoiler sign on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Turn Loghain is one of the main antagonists in the game. He betrays the king and sets into motion a series of plans to eliminate anyone who might oppose him politically. But he does not seek power for power's sake. He's terrified of the fact that the king and some of the most hardened royalists like Arl Eamon and Bryce Kuzlin are becoming increasingly amicable with the neighboring nation of Orlais. King Kaelin was considering to call for Orlesian chevaliers to help him fight the Darkspawn, and Arl Eamon himself married a young noble woman from Orlais shortly after the war. The game slowly but thoroughly gets you up to date on Ferelden's history and their past conflicts with the Orlesians. The Orlesians had occupied Ferelden for more than 80 years, even making some Fereldans into slaves. Turn Loghain was a Ferelden commoner back in those days, and he suffered the Orlesian occupation in his own skin. When King Merrick met him for the first time, he was all skin and bones, as the story goes. But the king offered Loghain a place in the army, and he fought so bravely and ardently for his nation that he climbed up the ladder of the army until he became Turn, an unprecedented feat for a commoner. He also became King Merrick's best friend, a friendship that he truly seemed to treasure in his own way.
I've seen painted, masked lords beat an old farmer to death with riding crops. To this day, I don't know why. Is that hate? I saw good, sensible men fight armored chevaliers with nothing. No weapons, no armies, not even hope of success to see the occupation end. Is that hate? You won't believe me when I tell you this, but it doesn't matter. I never fought because I hated Orlais. This was for Merrick and for Eldon. What does that matter? He was my king. More importantly, he was my friend. Death doesn't end that. I didn't want to start a war, I wanted to stop one.
And see, this is what makes Teyrn Loghain stand head and shoulders above most other villains in other games. You can understand and even relate to a certain extent to the man. His motivation feels very real and his purpose legitimate. Teyrn Loghain isn't a great villain because of Simon Templeman's marvelous voice acting. He's not great because he's cunning and calculating. He's great because the game is solidly built upon a deeply rooted lore that presents him as a product of his time, shaped by the circumstances he's had to endure, and who is terrified of the prospect of having to relive them. And that is also what makes each of the 6 origin stories great in their own right. Some are better than others, of course, but all of them constrain you to a reality that you cannot escape. You are a castless dwarf, a piss-poor brand with nothing to his name, whose sister needs to whore herself out to make ends meet. You cannot talk down to the local crime lord and tell him to sod off because, like he says, you eat off his platter. You cannot participate in the provings because castless dwarves are forbidden to do so. It's an event to honor the ancestors, and you have none. None that the city cares to remember, at least, because they were criminals and lowlives. You are an elf who lives in an alienage, and you have to marry the candidate that your family has chosen for you, because arranged marriages are how things work amongst alienage elves. You cannot say, sorry, I'm not going to marry anyone because I'm strong and independent and I don't want to. In all these origins, the game gives you some space to exercise your individuality, but who you are and what you have to do does not solely depend on what you want. There is no inserting yourself in this fantasy exactly as you are with your modern day mindset and priorities. You have to play the hand that you have been dealt. And that to me is the true essence of role-playing. And this game gives you 6 different opportunities to do just that, and they are all grounded in some of the beefiest and juiciest lore there's ever been in the realm of video games. As for the story itself, don't expect Planescape Torment levels of narrative here. Dragon Age Origins does not seek to philosophize on the big questions of humanity. It's in the camp of entertaining stories with high stakes and satisfying finales, but it's one of the most epic ones in that league. It's a thrilling adventure with ever-increasing stakes, fantastic companions who tag along for the ride, and a world filled with fascinating people and places. The story isn't perfect, of course. Sometimes characters speak and think in ways that come off as way too modern for the times depicted, like the use of the word creepy.
Right, very creepy, forget I asked.
Which is a word that only appeared in English language around the early 1800s. The story in Dragon Age Origins also has a couple of really bad plot points, especially one near the end when they needed to justify the fact that the final confrontation needed to take place in Denerim, but it also needed to be a fight to reclaim the city, not to defend it. So they needed to provide a reason for the army to leave Denerim so that they had to come back later to reclaim it. This is all pretty shitty and contrived as it is, but the explanation they gave was even worse.
Riordan tells us that the bulk of the Horde is in fact heading towards Denerim. They are perhaps 2 days away from the capital.
What? Are we sure about that? I mean, if that's true...
I ventured close enough to listen in, as it were. I am quite certain.
Hold up! Wait a minute! Something ain't right!
A few days before...
The real question is how we are going to get your friend past the Darkspawn, is it not?
That's true. We can sense the Darkspawn. Conversely, they can sense us.
So, which one is it, game? Did Riordan get close enough to listen into the Darkspawn, and let's ignore how cheesy that is? Or are the Darkspawn also able to sense the Grey Wardens because of the taint in their blood? Both of these things can't be true at the same time, unless Riordan has super hearing a la Superman and was just outside the Darkspawn's detection range. You also have some clumsy information dumps that feel like they've been pulled straight out of an aaaall game, like NPCs talking to your character about things he or she is already supposed to know, just to give you some context or information that you are supposed to have as a player. And you also have this passage.
Step forward, Jory.
But I have a wife, a child. Had I known...
There is no turning back.
No! You ask too much. There is no glory in this.
Jory was warned that there was no turning back, as were you all. When he went for his blade, however, he left me no choice.
This hardly seems the only option Duncan had. I don't see how Duncan couldn't tell Jory, "Okay, Jory, put your blade down, no need to fight. You can always go to the king and say that you want to fight as a regular soldier. Just tell him that I sent you and that you are a pussy who can't be a Grey Warden. Now shoo, why did he kill him? Was it so that he wouldn't reveal the secret of the Wardens? Isn't that something that he could have done just as easily after drinking the blood and surviving the ritual? Also, don't a lot of people already know how this Grey Warden business works? I also find it very convenient that everyone who knew Duncan speaks super highly of him, and as a player, you never get the chance to say, Duncan might have been a hero, but he was also a bastard who wouldn't hesitate to kill a man who refused to do as he said, because the Blight demands sacrifices. Someone who thinks he's the one who gets to decide what types of sacrifices needed to be made and how. But oh well, I suppose Ferelden is a different place with different values and a different history. I also remember that back in the day, when the game came out, I used to have a bit of a gripe on the fact that beyond your origin story, the game is not dramatically different for a mage, a human noble, or a dwarf commoner, to name a few. There is an exceptionally different outcome that you can only get if you play as a human noble. And in my opinion, you can only get the very, very best version of that outcome if you are a human female noble. And you can only get the very, very best experience if you are a completionist, that is, if you are a human female noble rogue. Which are 4 things that I hardly ever choose to play as in my games, but I do strongly recommend that you play at least one with this combination of things. People address you and treat you differently depending on your race and your origin. If you're a Kuzlin, a lot of people will recognize you and treat you with deference. If you are a dwarf, most people will assume that you are a merchant. And if you are an elf, no one will take you seriously, and some people will even laugh at you when you say that you are a Grey Warden.
I wasn't aware elves could join the Grey Wardens.
And that's cool and all, but I wish the game had gone beyond that. There could have been origin-specific missions and outcomes. For example, if you played as a Kuzlin, there could have been a mission for you to return to High Ever after the Landsmeet to purge your home of Arlhau's men and maybe pay your respects to your dead family. If you played as an Aidukan, there could have been a special mission for you at the Aidukan Taig, and maybe a way to prove to the Assembly that Balin killed your brother. And if you played as an elf from the Alienage, you could have had a special secret way to access the Alienage without having to wait until you gathered all your allies almost at the end of the game. And I know for a fact that there was some content that we didn't get to see, that was originally intended to be in the game at some point, but got removed for the release version of the game. You were meant to have origin-specific companions like Jawan, Sir Gilmore, Gorim, and Lesky. And I know this because there is a mod that restores some of that content, and it comes with fully voiced conversations by the original actors and all. But this is a gripe that I used to have back in the day, when the Arcanum and the Fallout experiences were still relatively fresh. But in this day and age, Dragon Age Origins feels jaw-droppingly unique because games that care about you being this or that race, with this or that origin, are rare these days, never mind something as complex as an origin-specific story. The gripes I have with the game's story amount to very minor nitpicks. The story in Dragon Age Origins is
amazing.
It's masterfully paced, it's driven by high stakes at all times, and it ends with one of the most glorious and epic climaxes in the history of video games. It also strikes the perfect balance between a novel-like structured narrative and player agency. It's as tight as any book in the medieval fantasy genre, but it features 16 different possible endings, and we're talking about truly different endings, not different flavors of the same outcome. We are talking about an almost Fallout New Vegas-like array of outcomes and a final succession of stills to go along with it. And the game is eager to tell you what became of Ferelden, the Dwarven Kingdom, the Dalish Elves, the Tower of Magi, Redcliffe, the Alienage, your companions, and yourself as a consequence of your actions and decisions. If you played and liked Baldur's Gate 3 and you haven't played Dragon Age Origins yet, boy, believe you me, you are in for the treat of a lifetime. By the time the credits roll in this one, you'll have no doubt about where your favorite Baldur's Gate 3 moments got their inspiration from, and I'd be willing to bet that some of you will be wowed by Dragon Age Origins. But if you don't like your game to be heavy with cinematic cutscenes, then this might not be the game for you. I've played this game 13 different times by now, and I just can't seem to be able to finish it and not start it again immediately. I think that should tell you all you need to know. Whatever flaws this story has, and it does have a few, are compensated many times over with the game's own brand of epic glory. And I really don't want to end this section without mentioning how Dragon Age Origins handles its humor. This is yet another aspect in which this game beats everyone else in the league thoroughly. Dragon Age Origins features the perfect balance of gravitas and comedy.
Fart me a lullaby. It's a memorial of all the dwarves who became golems.
Most of your companions have a comedic relief facet that comes out exactly when it needs to. And even companions who don't have much of a funny side to them have their funny moments here and there. Oghren and Wynne have some of the most hilarious party banter in the game. And Liliana brings out her lunatic A-game when she's talking to your dog. But these funny moments never come at the expense of breaking character. Stakes are always high in Dragon Age Origins, but the game doesn't take itself any more seriously than it needs to, and that's why it's filled with comedic relief characters, situational comedy, and what in my opinion is hands down the funniest party banter in the history of games. But none of that humor ever comes off as farcical, and none of the characters ever feel like they are worrying about stuff that's inconsistent with their needs and predicaments. And this is something that you don't see too often in games these days. Companions Lorewise. BioWare used to be the king when it came to companions in video games, and Dragon Age Origins is, in my opinion, second only to the Mass Effect saga in this respect. Every companion is a window into a part of the game's lore. Want to know more about Antiva, the Crows, or about how assassins operate? Just talk to Sevron at camp. He has enough stories to keep you entertained for several nights, and some of them are actually pretty good. Some are sad, some are hilarious, and some are exciting. The same is true of Alistair, Oghren, and Shale. Even their personal stories are not an endless exposition of how this or that made them feel. Their background stories are actually useful for you to get a picture of what the world of Dragon Age is like. There is no victimhood thrown around, no self-pity, and no self-loathing. Their personalities are also quite complex compared to companions in most other games. The game is not trying to hammer the one particular trait the character is supposed to be about. Oh god. Even Oghren, who initially comes off as a stereotypical drunken dwarf who's there for comedic relief, eventually reveals a character arc and finds purpose in helping you rid the world of the Darkspawn threat. Morrigan is a witch of the wilds who has been mothered by a powerful being of legend.
The Flemeth? From the legends?
And that's why, despite the fact that she lives in the wilds, isolated from the rest of the world, she is a worldly woman who knows a great deal about magic, history, geography, and the peoples of Ferelden. It's a little bit hard to buy that she wears perfect makeup, has a great sense of fashion, rocks a perfect Brazilian wax, and walks like a professional model down a catwalk. but I know some of you love that shit. Characters like Alistair and Morrigan have a huge impact on the story, and while the game never steals the spotlight from the main character, you can easily see how the story would have played out if you hadn't been in the picture. In fact, the only reason why Alistair isn't the protagonist is because, well, you don't play as him. Liliana is the standout character of the lot for me, easily one of my favorite companions ever. She is a bard from Orlais who is hiding more than her fair share of skeletons in the closet. She's initially deceitful about her past and feeds you the story that she feels the most comfortable with, a unique blend of half-truths and blatant lies. But as the game progresses, and as she starts to get the feeling that you are not going to judge or punish her for her past decisions, she opens up about her past and her present. And her story is so good that BioWare even made it into a standalone DLC called Liliana's Song. I 100% think you should have been given the option to play this DLC from within the game, as some sort of flashback story that could have been triggered from the short version of the story that she already tells you at camp. When you first meet Liliana at the tavern in Lothering, she comes off as a crazy Chantry devotee who has supposedly had this weird vision about the Maker and the Darkspawn. And though it is a facade that she uses to protect her identity and deflect queries about her past, she isn't all that right in the head either. She's not a complete lunatic, but she has a couple of loose screws in the noggin. She is interested in art and fashion, she's a devoted Andrastian to boot, she knows a lot about politics, and she's very open-minded about sex. She swings both ways, and she's not against having a foursome. But that's not all there is to Liliana, not by a long shot. She was a bard for a long time, a traveling minstrel who had also performed shady services for important political figures to tip the balance of power in favor of her clients. And she used to work for a fixer of sorts, a woman named Marjolaine. Because she used to be a minstrel who traveled all around the world and made a living off of storytelling and music, she is a worldly woman with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the world of Thedas. Want to know more about the Darkspawn and how they came to be? Want to know more about Flemeth, the famous Witch of the Wilds? Or maybe you're interested in Orlesian and Ferelden folklore? Well, Liliana's your girl for all of that. No one makes the camping experience more immersive than the sexy redhead with a touch of crazy. Also, your companions have something to add to almost every conversation. Sometimes they come up with suggestions or warnings, and even your dog has his way to make his opinion known.
Step no further!
Speaking of which, your dog in Dragon Age Origins is the best dog companion in the history of games. I'm sorry, Rex. He's funny and smart, and he has a keen eye for assholes and demons.
And a hound amongst them.
And every companion has his or her share of funny conversations with a dog. And you have some of the most hilarious camp scenes between the Mabari and the rest of your companions. You can also pet him and ask him to fetch stuff for you. You can't even try to appoint him as your champion at the Landsmeet, though no one is too impressed with that.
Warden, no. I'm afraid we can't leave the fate of all Ferelden up to your dog. Anyone with a leftover hambone could buy his allegiance. Choose someone else.
Also, like we said, the party banter in Dragon Age Origins is one of the funniest out there. It might not be as interesting or as grounded as your party banter in Baldur's Gate 2, but it's pretty damn close and twice as hilarious. Companions gameplay-wise. Your companions in Dragon Age Origins are deceitfully unique, with the exception of your dog and Shale, the golem that comes with a Stone Prisoner DLC. Your companions don't really have character-specific skills as they do in Tyranny, for example. They have access to the talents of their classes just as you do, but they do have specializations. Sevron and Liliana are both rogues, for example, but Sevron is an assassin and Liliana is a bard, and these specializations are quite different. And if you yourself are a rogue, you'll only be able to learn these specializations once you've met these companions and gotten them to talk about their line of work. And the game offers mountains of lore to add further context about what it means to be an assassin or a bard. But there's also the fact that you meet your companions throughout the adventure, and not all of them at the very beginning of the game as it happens in Divinity Original Sin 2 or Baldur's Gate 3. And this means that they will have the same level that you have by the time you meet them, and that also means that they will have learned some skills and spells by that time. When you meet Liliana in Lothering, for example, she already knows a couple of archery and rogue talents. She also has the Bard specialization, and she has at least one Bard talent. Sevran, on the other hand, knows a few dual wielding and a couple of assassin talents. The same is true of Morrigan and Wynn. They are both mages, but they have different specializations, they know different spells, and they fulfill very different roles in your party. In fact, I usually had both of them in my party at all times. Then you have your dog and Shale, who have talents that are specific to their characters and can be quite impressive in their own right. And outside combat, your dog even has the talent to go scouting around. Sometimes he can even bring you OP items like the helmet called Duty, which is a part of an armor set no less. Combat in Dragon Age Origins isn't easy, and the only way to consistently dominate the game on the combat end of things is to make your companions play to their strength, and you can do this by means of incredible cross-class synergies, and many of them are specific to your party's composition. Also, quest-related dialogue scenes can be quite different and even have different outcomes depending on who you have in your party. If you go to Haven with Sten, for example, he will get angry and attack you for wasting time. But if you take him to Lake Kalinhad and approach Carol while he's in your party, he will help you get into the tower more easily.
Parshera, here, munch on these if you like.
Ho, cookies!
I am content to part with them if it saves us from this fool. There was a child, a fat, slovenly thing, in the last village we passed. I relieved him of these confections. He didn't need more.
If you help Father Colgrim, Liliana will leave the party for good, and if you surrender to Sir Calthrian while rescuing Honora, you will lose massive reputation with Ogren and Stan if either one of them is in your party. And if you get captured at Arl House Estate, you'll have to appoint two of your companions to go on a rescue mission, and the dialogues in this rescue mission vary greatly depending on who you choose.
Fate truly has a sense of humor. That tale should have fooled no one.
Yeah, especially the way you act. A Bronto in a bonnet would do a better job of passing for a merchant.
So yes, gameplay-wise, your companions have a huge impact on how things play out in every aspect of the game. In fact, this is the game that spoiled every other RPG in this department for me. Now I want every game to be Dragon Age Origins. Secondary mechanics and user experience. There is trading, inventory management, tactical management, and crafting in Dragon Age Origins. These mechanics are what they need to be for the most part, given the game's design and focus. Crafting is pretty straightforward. You have 3 main crafting disciplines in the core game, and there's a skill tree for each of them that has only one branch. You have traps, poisons, and potions. Some vendors sell recipes for all these things, and they require crafting materials. Potions and poisons can be useful in combat, but poisons can only be used by people who have at least 1 skill level in poison, which is interesting because every melee character can benefit from poisons. But to make no mistake about it, crafting is strictly utilitarian in Dragon Age Origins. It's not something you are supposed to engage with the way you do in, say, Skyrim, for example. Like we've said, the tactical panel is an interesting concept, but it's only marginally useful because it's lacking some very important features. Trading and inventory management are perfect the way they are. So much so, in fact, that I just can't understand why it hasn't become the standard. Pillars of Eternity's system is even better, of course, but I see it as an improvement over Dragon Age's original system. First, you have a common inventory, which is a blessing. There is no need for individual inventories per character in a single player game. And you have this beautiful filter here that allows you to compare what you are about to sell or purchase to what anyone else in the party has in the pertinent slot. The only exception to this is the secondary weapon. You cannot compare the weapons available for purchase with someone's secondary weapon. You also have tabs that allow you to filter items by type, which is always a good thing. And the fact that this game does not have scrolls simplifies things a great deal. And I like that this simplification does not come at the expense of a diminished challenge. If I had to level some criticism at the inventory management mechanic in this game, I'd say that you only get a stash once you've completed the Soldier's Keep DLC, and even then, you have to fucking go to this place to store your items, which is a huge bummer. You should have had a stash in your camp. As for the user experience, combat takes a little bit getting used to if you come from games like Arcanum, the Temple of Elemental Evil, or Baldur's Gate, but once you figure out the ropes, chances are you'll come to understand why this is the best system for this game. To me, it feels like a much improved version of Neverwinter Nights 2. Since you sometimes need to move the camera around to target your enemies, the game might feel a little bit slower than other real-time with pause combat systems. And even after you've figured out how the camera works, you'll see that there are some situations in which you just can't get the camera exactly where you want, but these situations aren't too frequent or too annoying. Outside of combat, the game's user experience is the standard you've come to expect in modern day gaming. Automatic lockpicking, proper highlighting of interactable objects, all the expected features are here. So overall, great stuff in this department as well. Sound effects and mix. There is great attention to detail in Dragon Age Origins sound design. From the bows tensing and releasing in combat sequences, to birds chirping and the sound of children playing in the distance, to the different post-production effects that apply to caves and tunnels, to the sound of your dog running around, or whimpering, or growling, or barking, or making that manipulative sound that we're all too familiar with. Combat sounds are pretty freaking dope too for the most part. The sound of the whirlwind tornado flames of your Inferno spell sounds like even you are going to go down in flames in your couch. The lingering sound of lightning of your AoE lightning spell is also pretty fucking dope, as is the sound of the chilly whirlwind of your blizzard spell. And if you cast all three of these AoE spells, one after the other, over the same area, you unlock the Maelstrom combo. And these three spells sound crystal clear at the same time without cluttering each other. There are some sounds that could have been better. Shattering a frozen enemy is a damn near orgasmic experience, but it's more because of the visual impact of the action and the precise timing of the sound than because of the sound itself. It doesn't sound like a crystallized thing being blown to pieces. The mix is mostly great, but there are a couple of notable slip-ups. Sometimes there is party banter that sounds like it's coming from 3 towns away while your companions are standing right next to you. Your party banter also gets interrupted when another conversation starts, and there are a few volume issues here and there. The worst of them are the mechanical traps in the deep roads. Also, there could have been a greater variety of ambient sounds for cities. The same sound of children playing in the distance gets old at some point. Overall, it is pretty impressive and definitely ahead of its time. But today it's not its time, and it does come off as a little bit dated. Voice acting.
Let me be blunt with you. After all this time, my tolerance for social graces is fairly limited. That doesn't bother you, I hope.
Shave my back and call me an elf. Bronca, by the stone, I barely recognized you.
Know this. All Grey Wardens can sense Darkspawn. Whatever their cunning, I guarantee they won't take us by surprise. That's why I'm here.
You see, Sir Knight, we might die, but we'll be warned about it first.
That is reassuring.
Logain, this is an honor. That the Regent would find time to greet me personally.
How could I not welcome a man so important as to call every lord in Ferelden away from his estates, while a blight claws at our land? I had hoped to talk you down from this rash course, Eamon.
Our people are frightened. Our king is dead. Our land is under siege. We must be united now if we are to endure this crisis. Your own sister, Queen Rowan, fought tirelessly to see Ferelden restored. Would you see her work destroyed? You divide our nation and weaken our efforts against the Blight, with your selfish ambitions to the throne.
It's all over the fucking place, I tell you. Some characters sound like they wouldn't be out of place in the OG Deus Ex, and that means that they are hilariously bad. But on the other hand, you have some of the best performances you have ever had in gaming. In the past, much as it happened with cinema, vocal performances used to be a lot more theatrical. Actors used to emphasize the dramatic intention of whatever they were saying a heck of a lot more. In newer video games, actors try to come off as realistic as possible. Some people like it better this way, and some people prefer the old ways. I think overall Dragon Age Origins sits just at the right spot between these two approaches. Loghain sounds menacing and dangerous without sounding cartoonish. Arl Lehman is a level-headed man concerned about the current state of the nation who sounds regal and mature. And all of your companions have clearly distinct personalities that come off as believable and grounded in verisimilitude for the most part. The voice direction in the game is fantastic, but it also features what in my opinion is the most spectacular fuck-up in the history of voice acting direction. The guy who plays Murdoch, the Major of Redcliffe, changes the voice he's using for the characters several times, during the same conversation. It sounds as though he was called on for extra recordings and both he and the voice director forgot the voice that he was using. But that fuck up aside, everyone is always aware of the vibe they should be giving off as characters and in every particular situation, and they are always consistent with the dramatic intention of the passage. The voice acting in Dragon Age Origins is not perfect by any means, but still awesome to the point of being memorable. Music.
For Ferelden!
The music in Dragon Age Origins is epic as fuck. It's consistent with the theme and the tone of the game, and some of its tracks feel like narrative pieces on their own. The title track, for example, features a dark, sinister melody that gradually dies out to give way to a benevolent-sounding chant that is also eventually consumed by the dark melody again. To me, it feels as though this musical dynamic is trying to mirror the nature of the struggle of good versus evil in Dragon Age Origins, a cycle that can never be broken, just like blights continue to threaten the world time and time again, even though the Grey Wardens manage to defeat them every time. Combat tracks are pretty efficient at delivering a sense of urgency and danger, and they don't feel overproduced or on the nose as is the case with most medieval fantasy RPGs these days. I wish it had more tracks though. Some of the combat music can get repetitive, and there seems to be only one tavern track in the game. The third game in the series, Dragon Age Inquisition, has the best music in the saga by far, but the music in Origins is also great. Graphics. Dragon Age Origins may not be the best looking game of its time, and it hasn't aged particularly well. Cities and settlements look busy enough and there's enough detail to make them feel lived in. But compared to the city of in Baldur's Gate 2 or some other cities in earlier isometric games, cities and settlements feel small. It feels as though you only ever get a snippet of each place to get a taste of what they are like. Compare Denerim, which is the largest city in the game, to any city in Morrowind or Skyrim, for example. Even Mask of the Betrayer, the expansion pack for Neverwinter Nights 2, which came out a few years before, feels larger in scope when it comes to its locations. Dungeons are a different thing. Locations like the Tower of Magi and the Temple of Ruin, where you find the Ashes of Andraste, are big and detailed. On the other hand, outdoor locations, like the ones where you get ambushed when you are traveling about, feel like the bare minimum effort, and in some cases, you get some pretty bad low-res textures. Character models are a bit on the potato side of things by today's standards, but you can make the game look very modern day with a few mods, so there is no excuse not to give this one a shot these days, even if you're the kind of person who obsesses about graphics. Armor and weapons are surprisingly detailed. Some of those textures look a lot better than some of the stuff you get in Solasta, for example, which came out only 3 years ago. If you find all the named weapons and armor in the game, including DLC weapons and armor, you also get a nice variety of items, which is something that was a little bit lacking in the vanilla game when it first came out. Some of the outfits on some of the NPCs are wildly, hilariously inconsistent. This noblewoman at the Kuzlan estate looks like a beggar compared to her lady-in-waiting. Some noble kids look like street urchins. The Dalish keeper wears the same robes as the first enchanter in the Circle of Magi, and her second in command looks even fancier with an outfit that you only see again on the Tervinter mages at the Alienage. Why? I think the UI deserves a special mention here. I think that a UI like the one you get in Solasta, while neat, practical, and intuitive, is a little bit immersion breaking. I really do miss the days of UIs like the one you get in Icewind Dale 2, and I think Dragon Age Origins strikes the perfect balance between artistic consistency and practicality. You can tell that a lot of work and attention to detail went into its design. This party selection screen has a special animation for all your party members when they get chosen and rejected, and it's colorful and filled with detail. I still remember the disappointment when I first went into Dragon Age 2's party selection screen. No animations, no fancy artwork, it was the bare minimum. Like many other things in that game, but that's a different story that will not be told in this channel. Cutscenes are also amazing. This is a true cinematic experience, from the guy who begins to retreat in fear at the sight of the Darkspawn army and is stopped by his comrade, who then points at the horde with his chin as though saying, "It's that way, buddy." To your allies marching to Redcliffe and the father saying goodbye to the kid, to the initial cutscene of every Origin, Dragon Age Origins still holds up in my book. It also has some pretty brutal fatality animations. Finishing ogres and dragons is especially badass. I do have one major criticism though. Man, this game is so fucking brown. No, this is not a joke, and it's not a nitpick, I'm serious. Everything is just too fucking brown. The human cities, Bozamar, the Dalish forest, the swamp, the clothes, the trading interface. I usually don't care too much about the color palette in my video games, but Dragon Age Origins is just too fucking brown. Overall, graphics are decent in Dragon Age Origins, but it is a bit of a mixed bag. Performance and stability. It has its issues. I had a few crashes to the desktop, and I remember some of those occurring at the exact same places as they happened on my Windows 7 machine a few years ago. Luckily, I know the game like the back of my hand, and I saved every time right before the crash. In some of the busier locations, the game can get a little bit slow, especially if you go hard in the paint with a Maelstrom spell combo. As for bugs and glitches, there are a few to speak of. There is an armor piece that's missing from a cabinet in Lothering, and there's a way to lock yourself out of completing all of the Blackstone irregular quests if you hand in a quest at the Blackstone outpost in Redcliffe instead of at the one in Denerim. Some traps cannot be disarmed because they cannot be clicked on, and some chests require you to position yourself in weird places to open them. So overall, it's not the smoothest game you've ever played, but it's not bad enough to take a toll on the fun factor. Other considerations and final thoughts. Like many of you, I too was ready to declare that I had lived the golden age of video games in the late 90s and early 2000s with Fallout, Planescape Torment, Baldur's Gate 2, Arcanum, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and so on and so forth. It's not that there weren't any cool games after that, it's just that those particular titles that were released between 1997 and 2002 felt like peak gaming, like lightning in a bottle in some sense. And I guess it's easier to face the prospect of adulthood, so to speak, with the feeling that, although you won't have as much time to indulge in your favorite hobby as you used to, it won't matter as much, because you were lucky enough to have lived in the golden age of games. But then Dragon Age Origins came out to make a strong, simple statement. No, you haven't. Every game-changing title that comes out certainly waters down the impact of every other game that follows in its wake, but just like Olympic records can always be broken, there's always a chance that the gaming world will get turned on its ear forever, even by the standards of us old men who yell at clouds. And I think Dragon Age Origins is proof of this. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. Share the video if you thought it was cool, but most importantly, never stop gaming, but don't let gaming get in the way of your hopes and dreams. Bye everyone.